The sea gnawed at Dragonstone's cliffs with patient teeth, a rhythm older than kings. The morning mist crept in from the bay and gathered along the steps carved into black stone, turning the fortress into a shape half seen. Dragons and knives and memories all blurred to one cold breath. Jon Snow stood where the wind could scour him clean, cloak furred with damp, the taste of salt on his tongue. The skiff that had brought him and Davos rocked at the landing below. The men who had escorted them up the steps waited discreetly out of earshot. Even here, even with eyes on his back, he felt the quiet pull of the north like a hearth remembered in winter. He was led through halls that glimmered faintly with torchlight, their walls sweating sea water the way caves did. The throne of Dragonstone was shaped like a spine of stone, cold and serrated, as if some ancient creature had died and left its bones to be sat upon. Below it stood the woman the songs had named Stormborn, the queen made by a pyre and a birthright and 3 living shadows that hooked their claws into the air. She watched him come forward. Her hair was a pale banner braided against wind. Her face was not the girl from rumors, but a woman carved by grief and heat and stubbornness. Her counsel stood near. A clever-eyed dwarf with the posture of a man who had learned to carry his own weight. A translator with a voice soft as rain. Soldiers in gray whose discipline ran like a wire through the room. "King in the north," she said. Her voice did not boom. It folded each word into the next with careful care. "You have come far without banners at your back. Sails are slower than ravens," Jon answered, and heard the echo of his father's caution in his own tone. "Ravens have brought me many things," she said. "Requests, threats, pleas, promises." She took a few steps down from the throne and let the last word hang. "You ask for stone and for trust. You offer what?" "Truth," he said, "and my hand." "Your hand?" she repeated, tasting it as if it were a foreign spice. "Not your knee." He met her gaze. "The North bled to choose me. They did not put me on my knees for anyone. If I kneel without their consent, I become a thief of their trust. I won't be one." The dwarf, Tyrion Lannister, the stories said, watched the exchange as if reading a chessboard whose pieces were all family ghosts. "And yet you ask for her armies, her dragons, her ships," Tyrion said gently. "Forgive me, but it sounds like you want everything a subject would receive without calling yourself one." "I ask to stand beside her," Jon said. He did not look away from the woman. "Equal, or not at all." A murmur went through the chamber, quiet and surprised. The queen's face did not change, but her eyes sharpened, a blade tilted toward light. "Equality," she said. "A convenient word when one partner has dragons that could burn fleets to ash." Davos coughed softly into his cuff. Jon kept his hands still. "I have a wall of dead men coming for my people," he said. "They don't care for thrones. They don't bow. You ask me for my knee. I ask you for your faith. If we live, we'll have years to argue the rest. If we die, the throne you take will be a chair in a hall of bones." There was silence. The wind moved through open slits in the stone like a breath through teeth. The translator, Missandei of Noth, watched both of them with the focused sympathy of a scribe listening for a city's last words. When the queen spoke again, it was softer. "Show me," she said. He led them to the caverns where the dragonglass grew like the night itself, made solid, black as truth, deep as time. Torches held high, they walked among pillars that seemed to brood. On the walls, the scraped marks of ancient hands formed spirals and lines, crude men and stranger shapes beside them, all carved long before the Undulls crossed with steel in their hands or dragonlords took Valyrian wives. The air smelled of stone and brine. "The children of the forest," Jon said. "Their marks. They fought the first men for thousands of years, then made peace because something worse came out of the cold. These are their warnings. I saw the worst thing with my own eyes." Daenerys moved closer to the wall, her fingers hovering a breath from the carvings. "You carry tales like iron," she murmured, "cold and heavy, and I can feel the weight. How does a queen weigh a thing she cannot see?" "By who holds it," Tyrion said quietly, and Jon heard there the tone of a man who had learned the edge of cynicism and had chosen to stand one step back from it. by how he speaks of it, by what he does not ask in return. Daenerys turned so the torch's light cut one side of her face, the other cast in shallow shadow. "I will not kneel to the dead," she said, "nor will I be cajoled by fear into shattering the promise I made to myself and to those who followed me. No tyrants, no chains." Her gaze found his and held. "But I will not be a fool either. Mine is not a crown of sand and stories. I've won it with cost enough to count. If I agree to stand beside you as equal, how will you keep your oaths to your people when I ask for theirs?" "You ask for loyalty," Jon said. "I can give you allegiance. The North does not do well with chains, but we honor pacts and we keep faith with those who keep faith with us. Say that we fight as one to face the dead. Say that the North remains free to choose its own lord after, that you rule the South and we rule ourselves, and I will bind myself to you with words that won't break." "2 thrones," she said, a hint of amusement in the thought. "2 winters to feed." The amusement vanished. 2 crowns, and 1 war first. 1 war first, he said. A dragon's shadow crossed the cave mouth then, the sound of wing beats like a flag whipped hard in a gale. The queen didn't flinch, and Jon felt something like hunger and like fear slide along his bones. When they went out again into the light, the creature had landed along the ridge of stone, its chest lifting and falling in thick, deliberate breaths. Its eyes followed her the way fire follows wind. She reached and laid a hand against a scale the size of a shield. "Drogon," she said to Jon, almost idly. "This is Drogon, who eats the cows of men who despise me and the goats of those who don't. He answers to me. He does not bow to anyone. He's never had to learn how." The dragon's head lowered until Jon could feel the exhale warm against his face. He did not move. The world creaked closer through that slit of breath. He lifted a palm, slowly, until the hard plane of the dragon's muzzle met the roughness of his skin. And he knew in a bone-deep way that this thing could have unmade him the way a tide eats a footprint. The dragon's eye nictitated once, measuring, and what it found, it did not disdain. Daenerys watched something unclench in herself. "You are very much not a liar," she said. "I have found," Tyrion observed mildly, "that a liar either flinches or smiles too soon when confronted by a dragon. That night in chambers that had once housed princes who wore their arrogance like perfume." She stood at a window and watched the sea pound itself for love of the shore. Missandei braided the last of a strand into Daenerys's hair. In the reflection of the glass, she saw herself as something both armored and almost human. "What do you think, Missandei? That men will bend to her who does not demand the bend, if she stands where they stand," Missandei said, "and that he believes what he says. There is no tremor in him for his own life, only for the lives behind him. 2 crowns." Daenerys tasted the thought again. There are no songs for 2 rulers. There are histories of consorts and regents, of shadows behind thrones. I did not cross deserts and cities to become anyone's shadow. Missandei's hands paused. "He did not ask you to." "No," Daenerys said. "No, he didn't." She turned from the window, the sea's breath thick as cloth. "Summon the forges. Call the miners from their hammocks. Strip the walls of every nail and hinge if we must. Sharpen night into spears. We go north when the mountain of glass has become a field of blades." "Your Grace," Missandei began, and Daenerys lifted a hand. "Say it anyway. The lords you conquer in the south will not like the terms," Missandei said. "They will say you gave away a kingdom you had not reclaimed yet." "They will say many things," Daenerys answered. "They will not say I burned their children for nothing." Dawn saw the Black Mountain blooming with sparks. Gendry, the smith Davos had smuggled out of one life and into another, set his hammer to the first of 1,000 spearheads with a face like a prayer said with sweat. The Unsullied drilled with unfamiliar weight at their spear tips. Dothraki, unaccustomed to fighting ghosts with anything but a curved blade and a scream, flicked obsidian knives through their fingers until they learned the balance by heart. Men from the north swung mattocks and cursed at rocks until the rocks gave way, and soon the storerooms were full of wicked dark shapes wrapped in oiled cloth. Jon learned the dragons' names by the cadence of wind: Drogon, Rhaegal, Viserion. He learned the way Daenerys moved along their shoulders like a woman stepping through memory. He learned the way Tyrion placed questions into a table like coins and waited to see how they were spent. He learned how Davos found men in kitchens and in courtyards and ended each conversation with laughter, and with a promise that the ship he no longer had would once again sail. He learned the way Missandei listened, always finding the word after 200 had been said that made the rest make sense. They sailed north under gray skies, the Queen's fleet cutting through the sea, and when the mists fell away, the white line of the wall stood like a sentence at the edge of the world. Jon felt his throat tighten at the sight of it. That old friend, that old prison, that old promise. Winterfell's towers rose behind it in memory first. Then in truth, banners twitching in a wind that brought with it the smell of wood smoke and wolves. They entered the courtyard to a forest of faces. Some curious, some hostile, some bright with a faith that made Jon want to step backward. Sansa stood above the doors, red hair pinned back with a northern woman's pragmatism, another sort of crown. She descended the steps with measured dignity, hugged Jon the way a sister holds a brother who is not hers by blood but is by everything that matters, then turned to the Queen with eyes as steady as an ice-choked river. "Welcome to Winterfell," she said to Daenerys. "You'll find our hospitality honest and our opinions unvarnished." "Honesty is better than flattery," Daenerys replied. "Opinions are better than daggers in the dark." Sansa's mouth tipped. "In the north, we often use both." Later, in the Great Hall, the murmurs rose to a boil. Lyanna Mormont stood. She was tiny as a wasp, fierce as one too. "We named you king in the north," she told Jon. "We bled for it. We don't take our promises off when we come indoors." "We made a pact," Jon said. "Not a surrender. She will not rule you. She will help us live. Until after," an older lord growled. "When the South calls its debts and we remember the South's kindness." Daenerys rose. Her voice was clear but not loud. "I have burned men who stood in my path because they chose chains instead of better chains. I won't apologize for that. I have also broken wheels that ground the weak into dust. I didn't come here as a conqueror. I came because I was asked. Your king refused to bend because he respects you. I will not ask him to break that respect for my sake. When the dead are ash in the fields, I will sit a throne if people put me on it. The North will not be my footstool. I'd rather have your friendship. If not that, I'd rather have your honest refusal than your forced truce." Sansa watched her with the measuring stillness she had learned from rooms where one misstep fed monsters. She raised her cup. "You do not speak like my father's enemies," she said, "and you do not look like my father's friends." "Neither do I," Tyrion murmured to Davos under the breath of laughter and firelight. "But I find I am rarely judged by my looks." They planned. Bran sat in his chair by the hearth and watched the flames as if they were a map. Sometimes he spoke, and when he did, men leaned in to hear what it was like to listen through time. "They are less afraid of walls than of water," he said, voice flat with odd certainty. "They dislike heat that is not fire. They look for sound, not sight. They hunt in rhythm." "Then we will break their rhythm," Grey Worm said, sketching positions on a rough, tallow-stained board. "We will drown their path with trenches and set those trenches alight." "Dragons will take the sky," Daenerys said. "Scorpions on the walls to shoot at anything Viserion carries if he comes. Archers with obsidian shafts along the inner ramparts. The Dothraki will not ride blind into a dark they cannot see. They hold the left with the unsullied, withdraw by whistle to draw the dead under the walls. The crypts will be sealed," Jon said quickly, memories of bones and cold hands rising up like bile. "We'll bring the children into the great keep, the older folk into the great hall, and soldiers at each door. No one alone. Torches every 10 feet along the inner courtyard. We will not store our fear in the ground this time and pretend it is safe." He looked to Daenerys and saw agreement already in her. It landed in him like relief, a step on solid rock. Night came like a tide smothering sand. The first snow had found them at dawn and was a steady sift, But after sunset the flakes grew heavy, choking the air until sound felt muffled, as if the world had pulled a blanket over its head. Out beyond the walls, the field was a knife of pale light under a cold moon. Men stood in ranks with their breath smoking from their mouths, faces blackened to kill the glare, hands steady on spear shafts that drank torchlight and gave nothing back. A horn sounded once, twice. The third note knelled. The far line fluttered as if white birds had startled. Then the birds became hands, and the hands became bodies, and the bodies came on with the grind of ice on ice. They hit like silence hits when a song stops. The first ranks buckled, bent, did not break. The trench went up a heartbeat later, fire running through pitch like a thought through a mind, sudden and precise. Screams of creatures that were almost human and not human at all rose like smoke. On the ramparts, archers sent shafts that vanished and reappeared in blue-lit flesh, and each time the light winked out, men breathed easier. The Unsullied pivoted as one to knit a gap. The Dothraki wheeled in tight circles, scything low at legs to buy space measured in breaths. Jon took the sky on Regal, who bucked once as if to test his rider and then climbed so hard Jon felt his ribs fold inward. Daenerys rose beside him on Drogon, a moving streak of darkness against a moon that seemed suddenly very close, her hair a pale line. Below, the dead unfurled across the field, new weight pressing at the trench. When it guttered and failed in one place, Grey Worm's whistle cut. The troops fell back as planned, and oil poured down a channel to catch at the weakness, flaring again. The Night King came on a wind that should not have existed, riding the ruin of Viserion, whose wings snapped holes through fog. His eyes were distant as stars. Jon and Daenerys turned toward him together, an angle of movement like two hawks banking. Drogon opened his jaws and poured fire, a river that made the night blink. The Night King glided through it untouched, the cold around him so arrogant it devoured flame. Now, Jon shouted over the wind, and Regal dove to shear Viserion off the arc that would take him over the inner wall. The dragons met like mountains colliding. Regal's talons tore at scar tissue that glowed. Viserion's teeth ripped at the base of Regal's wing. They fell. One shriek, a smear of white and black and blue tumbling past the high tower, into and through a line of dead that exploded outward like rotten sugar. Drogon stooped, a thunderbolt, trying to drive the Night King from his saddle, but the thing did not fall and did not fear. He lifted one arm and something in the air hardened. Drogon's scream shattered the dark, and then he was climbing. His side a lattice of ice that melted and refroze with each breath of flame. Daenerys' body moved with him as if wired to every sinew. Jon felt the ground spin upward and downward without sense. "Gates!" a guard screamed on the inner rampart. "Gates!" They held. They fell back. They held again. The courtyard became a snarl of close work. Men stabbed into faces they could not recognize until the light went out in those faces. And then they were faces again, slack with the release of whatever might have been mercy. In the Godswood, Bran sat very still while snow powdered his hair. Theon stood in front of him with men who had once known his cruelty and chosen anyway to stand at his side now. The wind moved in the leaves of a tree that did not move for wind, and something old watched with eyes carved to never blink. Arya moved through the courtyard like the memory of a lesson. Where she passed, the dead learned new ways to fall. She came to a place where a tower stair had become a funnel and found herself trapped between the ache in her shoulder and the emptiness of sky beyond a broken parapet. The Hound found her there because he had promised himself once, against his nature, that he would, and because sometimes promises remade are stronger than the first ones. "Little wolf," he grunted, killing as if it bored him to tedium, which was how he told the world he was afraid. "Don't do anything smart." She grinned, which was how she told the world she would. Jorah Mormont died by inches in front of Daenerys, not because he was brave, though he was, but because he had not known how to stop loving a woman who had saved his life in the only way that mattered. He moved between her and the dead until his sword became a part of his arm and the arm failed. He looked at her once, not with plea or apology, and she bent and pressed her brow to his and said a word in a language he had taught her. When he fell, Drogon shrieked again, and out beyond the gods would a cold figure turned its head as if hearing something that irritated it. The Night King walked into the gods' wood with nothing like hurry. The air curdled around him, frosting bark and breath. Theon planted his feet. "I took this castle from you," he told Bran in a voice that was not frantic and not calm. "I can't give it back, but I can stand once." "You are home," Bran said, and in his tone there was at last something like a boy beneath a man, or a man above a boy. "Thank you." Theon ran. He struck. He broke. He died. The Night King stepped forward through the falling flakes and looked at Bran, and it was like watching a storm contemplate a candle. Somewhere above the courtyard a shape moved. One knife, one breath, one decision. Arya came like a thrown thought. He caught her by the throat because inevitability is a kind of strength. She dropped the dagger because inevitability is also blindness. She caught it with her other hand and drove it up through the place where prophecy does not matter and stories do not line up neatly, into the spot that had once been a man's heart. The world made a sound like ice finally giving way under too much weight. The blue light went out of innumerable eyes like 1,000 shutters closing. Viserion dropped like a stone and cracked, not bone. Eon rock, but something else breaking. The Night King shattered and became a memory that weather would take. Silence did not come right away. Screams bled to cheers to sobs. Men fell to their knees not to pray, but because knees simply fail when what they are braced against vanishes. Snow drifted. The fire in the trenches burned itself to sleep. They built pyres in the morning. The heat of them made the snow melt in ragged circles. Sansa stood with Arya, their shoulders touching like the hinge of a door. Jon spoke very little, which his people understood to be a grief of its own. Daenerys moved among the dead like a sister of a strange faith, touching brow and braid and blade. When she came to Yora, she did not weep, but something in her face finally bent. After the smoke thinned and the ashes settled like a new dust on Winterfell stones, Bran called Jon and Daenerys to the Godswood. The weirwood's red leaves stirred in no wind. Samwell Tarly stood there too, flushed and earnest and terrified, which was his manner when he knew he carried something heavy. "We should not bury truths that matter," he said, and then he told them the name that had been hidden in a diary and a wedding and a woman's last breath. Aegon Targaryen, the boy named after an old king by a mother who had wanted him to be safe, not crowned. He watched Jon absorb it like the blow it was. Daenerys looked at Jon the way one looks at a storm still far from shore. Her face did not change, but her hands curled and uncurled. Once. "Do you want it?" she asked. "No," Jon said, and there was nothing in it of performance. He could not have made the word any other shape if he had tried. "I don't want it. Others will," Sam said carefully. "Others already do." Jon's eyes were tired with the kind of tired that layers itself upon the soul like silt. "Then we tell them to stop," he said. "We tell them this: I will not be set above her. I will not be set against her. I will not be used to unmake what we just saved. If there is any throne at all, it will have two shadows. If the North must be free to keep faith with itself, then let it be free under this pact we made." He looked at Daenerys until she was sure he was seeing only her. "You are not my queen. You are my equal." He expected some sharpness to come, some reminder that power was a hard-earned thing and not to be shared like a loaf in a poorhouse. Instead, she stepped closer, enough that he could smell wood smoke in her hair and the ghost of dragon fire in her skin. "And you are not my subject," she said. "You are my partner. Let us put it in words so fine even liars can't find a seam to pry at." They called a council in the shattered great hall, its banners smoke-stained, and the living gathered. Sansa's mouth was a thin line that could have been disapproval or concentration. Arya lounged as if this were only another testing ground. Tyrion paced with a thoughtful limp. Davos stacked bread on a plate and forgot to eat it. Grey Worm and Missandei stood like calm witnesses to a contract people didn't yet know they wanted. Daenerys spoke first. "The Seven Kingdoms are not a single beast," she said. "They are a herd yoked together and beaten until they run the same way. I will not whip the South into the same shape as the North, nor let the North be unmade to fit the South. The North will be self-ruled, as in the age before Aegon's fire, so long as its leaders keep faith with the realm when the realm stands in need. And the South? Sansa asked. I will take the throne that so many keep empty by pretending to sit it, Daenerys said. I will share its burden with the man who stands beside me. Our banners will fly together when the realm is threatened. Our courts will speak to each other as equals when it is not. A pact, sworn by stone and sea and snow, breakable only if broken together. Tyrion rubbed his jaw. You realize, he told them, that every lord south of the Neck will find a reason to hate this, not because it won't work, but because it wasn't their idea. Let them hate, Sansa said. We'll see how much they hate safety and full bellies. And the Iron Islands? Yara asked later, when summoned with a raven's ink-quick urgency and a ship that cut most weather to ribbons. She had reclaimed her seat with ropes and knives. The wind seemed to listen to her out of respect. We do not kneel well even to friends. Then don't, Jon said. Send ships when called, as your people do for storms. Trade salt for grain when needed. Reave no coasts under our protection, and we will send no dragons to salt yours. The same for Dorne, if they care to hear it. And the queen in the south? Yara scoffed. She will not sit for a diarchy. She can barely share a cup with her lover without poisoning it. Cersei will have her moment, Tyrion said, mouth flattening. But not forever. Nothing is forever. Cersei's answer to Raven's bearing terms of truce was laughter written as instructions. Euron's fleet slipped from the shadow of the silence like teeth. The Golden Company marched into the Crownlands with armor too bright and a reputation too old. Qyburn set scorpions on the walls like a man who had never seen a dragon up close and felt his courage correct itself. They did not go south the next day or the next week. They counted horses and people and food. They put plows into thawing fields. They sent ravens with names of dead to places that needed to know and to places that hadn't cared to know. The queen sat in rooms with northern stewards and learned the number of loaves a village needed when snow lingered late. Jon sat in rooms with unsullied captains and learned the sound of their soldiers' mourning when they kept it quiet for discipline's sake. The slow machine of survival spun, and it did not crush. It strengthened. When they finally sailed, the ships wore both wolf and dragon, and the people on the shores watched with faces that were not exactly afraid. Arya went because the pull of the south had its own kind of curiosity. The Hound went because he had left a promise at a doorway, and promises are the one thing he hated to leave unresolved. Brienne rode at the head of a small company of northern knights whose armor had been patched and repatched until it remembered other winters. Podrick sang at night in a voice that had found depth somehow in grief and grew stronger with every fire he sang beside. Jaime Lannister found them near the Trident because he had finally run out of lies to tell himself, and the last one had tired of being told. He handed his sword over because he had learned that holding it had meant less and less lately, and the world had noticed. They sat at a long table in a tower room at Dragonstone, smelling of salt and ashen ink. Maps were spread and pinned with knives where wind crept in uninvited. Tyrion drew arcs with a charcoal stub as he talked. Euron's ships here, the Golden Company there, the scorpions on the walls, the caches of wildfire in the city like rotten teeth in a mouth. Not that I know where all of them are, he added in a tone that proved he knew enough. Cersei inherited a city full of old anger and bottled it like a vintner with no palate. We don't burn the city, Daenerys said. She was holding a small figurine of a dragon, turning it once in her fingers. She did not look at Jon as she spoke. She didn't need to. We don't terrorize it into surrender. We excise scorpions and cut the Golden Company's hamstrings and make Euron fight a sea he can't charm. And then we take the Red Keep with ground we have earned. We may not avoid chaos entirely, Tyrion said delicately. We avoid ignoring it, Jon said. We avoid choosing it. Missandei's eyes warmed. Words we can explain afterward, she said. To those who lost and to those who won and must learn how to live together. Jaime, Daenerys said without preface. Your sister will not yield for the sake of others. She has never learned that trick. Will she run when the walls fall? Jaime's face was a ruin of old choices and new shame. If she runs, he said, It will be to find a higher wall. Good, Daenerys said. Let's take the lower ones first. The assault on King's Landing began with dawn refusing to be scared off by fog. The fleet divided like a pair of shears. Yara's ships sliding into Euron's path at an angle he didn't expect, ramming under and into the silence with a crack that was almost intimate. On the walls, scorpions swung and fired. Drogon and Rhaegal did not try to be invincible against them. They moved fast and low, two slashes of shadow that learned where the ropes ran, where the winches stood, where the crews clustered in the false safety of corners. They burned wood and iron. They burned machines that had been built for them, not homes that had sheltered children. On the ground, the Golden Company met the Unsullied and learned something about discipline that did not come in the same bottle they knew. Northern spears took the flanks and held them, quiet and steady, in a way that made a different sort of fear move in Sellsword's guts. Brienne and Grey Worm fought near the mud gate in a rhythm that didn't need words. Podrick's voice lifted somewhere behind them and men bled slower for it. The bells did ring because enough men in enough corners made enough choices. The sound lilted and folded across roofs that had watched kings die and kings be born and had come to suspect there was little difference. Daenerys held Drogon hard between her knees and felt the city's breath falter with each toll. She looked toward the Red Keep and saw it for what it was. A hill of blood turned to brick. She tasted ash in her mouth that wasn't from Drogon's last fire. You don't have to, something in her said that sounded like a self she had almost been. You don't have to prove it by breaking everything. She landed in the inner bailey with Jon at her side. Grey Worm held the left passage. Brienne took the right. The Hound went forward with a look on his face like a man walking into a memory he hated and needed. Somewhere in the dark above, his brother turned from a corpse he wasn't finished making. Tyrion and Missandei found a passage cut by some long-dead prince who had wanted to slip to a lover unseen. They used it to send a dozen northern archers into a courtyard where scorpion crews waited and yawned and died before they could learn they had enemies. Jaime reached the side gate because he remembered the way in that no one thought remained in his mind, and because he wanted to see if a life could take a corner it had missed before. Cersei waited in the Hall of 1,000 Flames that had never been lit properly since the days when dragons warmed its stones. Qyburn hovered, the smell of singed leather clinging to him like second skin. "My queen," he said. "The bells are ringing." "Then they think I have lost," she said. "They think that ringing will conjure a conscience out of smoke." "It might," he said, sounding not very hopeful. She smiled and he flinched because it was never meant for him. "Bring me wine," she said. "If I am to be merciful, I might as well be comfortable while I'm at it." Daenerys and Jon came to her with boots dusty from pulled-down walls and not a speck of blood they had chosen to spill on their hands. Tyrion stood with them at a respectful distance and said nothing. His mouth was a line as thin as a paper cut. Grey Worm held the door. The Hound had not returned, which meant he had found what he was looking for. Jaime stood to one side with his sword low, eyes on his sister the way a man watches a fire he knows could leap any direction. "Little brother," Cersei said, "you do like to arrive with other people's victories draped over your shoulders. I call it a habit, but it is older than habits. It is you. I liked you better when you lied less cleverly," Tyrion said, and she laughed. Daenerys stepped forward until she stood within arm's length of the woman who had sent assassins into nurseries and smiles into murder. She did not take that last step. "Your city yields," she said. "Your men yield. Yield, Cersei, and I will grant you a trial that will not be a mummer's show. Resist, and you will die here where you pretend your power makes you safe." Cersei took a sip from her cup. "A trial," she mused. "Before whom? The northern girl who learned to curtsy to her captors? The boy who thinks he's a tree? The men who call themselves unsullied, which is a word for air? Before the people you've hurt," Jon said, and his voice made the room colder. "Before the families who will bury their dead because you made choices and called it destiny. The people will cheer for bread and quiet," Cersei said. "They always have. They will cheer for your pretty story until it costs them. Then they will look for someone to take the cost away and hand it to someone else. That is what people do. And so the wheel turns. "The wheel breaks," Daenerys said, softer than Cersei expected, which is why Cersei blinked once. "Not by fire, not today, by the choice you make now. Walk out with us and let the world see you bound. Or drink what you've put in that cup and let them see you as you are. Alone in a hall that no longer belongs to you, with no one left to lie to." Cersei's face trembled with something that might have been rage or might have been a laugh that had grown too large to hold. She looked at Jaime, and for the first time in a very long time he looked not at her but through her, to a place beyond her shoulder where a future might be. She set the cup down. For a long moment she only watched it. "Tell the cook," she said finally, almost conversationally, "that the peaches are extortionately priced this season. It is important that someone know that." Then she picked the cup up and drank. It was not a theatrical death. She blinked once, twice, as if surprised that after so many performances the curtain could still fall. Jaime's face did not change. Tyrion's closed for a heartbeat. Daenerys stood very still, as if listening to the city inhale around her. Jon let out a breath that felt like winter turning. They did not parade the body. They did not leave it to rot either. King's Landing woke the next morning to carts bringing water and carts carrying bread, and strange soldiers speaking gently to terrified children in whatever words they had that still worked. The scorpions lay like carcasses along the walls. The bells hung quiet and dignified, their work done. Word spread fast that a queen and a king had entered the Red Keep and come out again without setting it alight. When rumors finally caught up to each other and made a story, it was that a woman had chosen how to die rather than let the city choose it for her. People understood that more than they understood crowns. The Great Council met in the Dragon Pit because it was the only place large enough to let people breathe without bumping into the past too often. They came from the Reach and the Stormlands and Dorne and the Riverlands, from the Vale and the Westerlands and the Iron Islands, from gullies and mountains and soft riverbends. Sansa spoke for the North with a voice that had learned to hold its own weight. Yara for the islands with wit that shielded steel. Gendry came in the name of the Stormlands because he had been made lord in a moment of mercy and was now learning that mercy was only the first half of a life's work. Brienne stood at the edge like a tower, a presence that made people mind their manners. Missandei took down every word as if words were a bridge future feet would need. Daenerys and Jon did not sit above them. They stood among them until talk threatened to sprawl. Then Daenerys raised a hand and used the only kind of power that endures. The kind that moves other people's hands to do what yours can't. "We have come through a night that would have made an end of songs," she said. "Now we will write new ones. The North is a kingdom that will answer to its own lords, bound by pact to defend the realm when called. The South is a realm that will answer to a crown worn by two hands. Each region will elect or acclaim its warden or prince by its own custom. Taxes will be accounted for publicly, in a way a child can read. Justice will be dispensed by judges who have nothing to do with my bed or his. The Citadel will send healers to every major holdfast who can read and cut and sew, and they will be paid by the crown, not by the purse of the man most in need." Tyrion tilted his head as if hearing music for the first time and recognizing it. Varys, who had returned quiet as a spider in morning dew, smiled with a sadness that seemed fused into his bones. "For a time," he murmured to no one and to everyone, "this will hold. For a time is longer than never," Davos said, and clapped him on the shoulder until Varys pretended to be wounded. Some fought it as Tyrion had promised. Some pretended to accept and wrote letters at night to men who had not yet learned they were obsolete. Some inflated themselves with old names and popped like bladders when faced with new air. Most went home with a strange lightness in their step, as if they had set down a pack they did not realize had been on their backs since birth. Work replaced war. The Red Keep's broken teeth were mended with stone quarried without slaves and laid by hands that were paid and fed. The dragon skulls in the cellars, once trophies and then warnings, were given to the Citadel to be measured and studied, because there is a way to honor fear that does not involve feeding it. A new fleet was begun in the Blackwater shipyards, and the first ship named Mercy was not the biggest but was the swiftest and was captained by a woman whose father had died in a riot when a boy king had promised bread the city could not afford. In the north, spring came like an apology. The snows receded reluctantly, and when they withdrew, the ground beneath was not dead, only shocked. Men bent their backs to seed and fence. Sansa walked through the kitchens and accounted the flour like coin. Arya packed maps and knives into a trunk and found that her feet itched less when she imagined west. Bran sat beneath the heart tree and began, once in a while, to smile. Daenerys came to the gods wood only once, because it felt to her like a place that must be kept rare. The weirwood's mouth was red and strange, but the air there was peace touched with something older than any creed she knew. Jon stood with his glove off and his palm against the bark. She did not speak until he turned. "We made something that might last," she said. "That's stranger to me than dragons." "It won't always be easy," he said. "It wasn't meant to be," she replied. "Neither were we." He reached for her hand then, not to claim it but to steady it. He had learned that love done right does not end in a throne room. It ends and begins again, in small rooms where people keep choosing the same person in front of them because the world is hungry and cruel and there must be somewhere it is not. She squeezed his fingers once, and when she let go, some part of him that had been clenched since childhood unwound. On a morning when the fog lay low as thought, Drogon lifted from the yard with a roar that made dogs bark all through the city. Rhaegal rose beside him, healed and savage and almost playful in the way he wheeled to nip his brother's tail. They punched through cloud and found a sky so clean it felt like breath after a fever breaks. Daenerys stood on the ramparts with her hair unbound, letting wind comb it. Jon came up behind her and did not speak. They had learned to share silence without making it an absence. "What now?" he said finally. "Now," she said, "we teach them that a crown is a Joe. B." She smiled then, small and real. "We teach ourselves the same." He huffed a laugh. "I'll need reminding." "So will I," she said. "We will remind one another." He looked toward the city, where markets were beginning to yawn open and children ran with mismatched shoes and women bartered hard as if it were a combat they enjoyed. He looked toward the north, which wore spring like a new cloak with patches and pride. He looked at her, and the look was uncomplicated in a way his life had rarely been. "I was taught to kneel," he said, "by oaths and emptiness. I forgot how to stand beside someone." "We are teaching each other many things," she said. "I'll forget some of them, so will you. We will set them out between us again like tools when we do." They went back to work. Tyrion built a treasury that counted its own honesty. Missandei wrote laws in a hand that even men who hated the laws grudgingly admired. Grey Worm took his soldiers south to break a slaver's ring that had slunk back into the Bay of Dragons, and he returned with ships full of people who had never thought they would see their children again. Gendry found that he had a knack for disputes about fences as much as for hammers. Davos taught boys to sail and made sure their mothers were the ones who chose when they left. Jaime commanded a city watch that forgot how to be cruel, then passed his staff to a woman who had once avoided their notice because it never did her any good and watched with wry pride as they learned to notice the right things. Varys vanished, as he did, and rumors put him in Old Town dragging new truths from old cells of thought. The Hound did not come back from the south, and no one asked because the sum of his life had always been to leave, and this, too, was a kind of peace. Arya sailed at last, west into waters where maps gave up and imagination took over. Sometimes a raven came with a feather tied to its leg and a scribbled line that was more a laugh than a letter, and Sansa kept them all in a drawer she never locked. There were uprisings and bad harvests and disease, because no law is a charm against the world's appetite. There were mistakes, some large, some petty, and there were nights when Daenerys woke and heard her father's voice in dreams trying to teach her the comfort of flame. Jon sometimes stood on a roof at midnight and stared toward friendly dark and thought of a wall that no longer held him and felt fear. Fear that had nothing to do with monsters and everything to do with the ordinary failure that topples kingdoms. They learned to say the truth of that fear out loud. They learned to apologize. They learned to accept apology. Years later, in a hall whose windows let in more light than torches, a boy asked his mother why the banners in the city showed a wolf and a dragon, and not just the dragon like in the old stories. The woman, who sold fish with a voice that could cut rope, said, "Because two heads are harder to fight than one, and because a man with a crown once learned to share, and because a queen learned to listen, and because two people looked at a city and loved it in a way that wasn't hungry. The boy made a face. But which one is more important? The one doing the listening, she said, and flicked his ear, and he laughed. In the godswood, a weirwood that had never been cut raised its white arms over a ground that had learned the shape of peace. Jon knelt there sometimes out of habit and stood after out of choice. Daenerys sometimes came and stood beside him with her hand in his, and they would say nothing until the wind came and made talking seem redundant. And autumn found them at Winterfell when the leaves went as red as small fires. They walked the ramparts. A boy practiced the bow below them, his feet wrong, his grip stubborn. Sansa called down, corrected him, watched him try again, nodded when he improved. Arya's ship came into White Harbor with a figurehead carved like a cat, and she slung herself into the great hall with a grin that ate her face and spilled strange fruits on the table until even Bran smiled. Ghost slept under a bench and pretended not to hear when anyone used his name. Jon and Daenerys found a quiet doorway and leaned in it the way people do who have discovered that leaning is not the same as leaning on. "My father used to bring me here," Jon said, and he heard what he had said and laughed low. "Ned. He wasn't my father by blood, but he wore the word well." He looked at her. "You wear your crown well." "So do you," she said. "It sits on the world, not on your head. That is where it belongs." Snow began, thin as lace. She lifted her face to it. He watched her. The air smelled of wood smoke and apple and the flat balsam of pine. Somewhere a song drifted up, one of those old northern melodies that sounded like wolves thinking about how to love their own. He reached for her hand. "I am glad I did not kneel," he said. She squeezed back. "And I am glad I learned how to stand beside you." The wheel had not shattered. It had been taken apart with patience, the spokes laid out and whittled into tools. People still argued in marketplaces and in council rooms. Wars did not vanish, but they came for reasons that could be spoken aloud, and too many men learned there were better ways to be brave than dying for a mistake. Dragons faded into the skies and then came back down again when called for festivals, and the children's eyes went wide, and that was a kind of victory that no ledger needed to tally. When old age came for them, and it did with the same politeness it uses for farmers and queens, people told stories. They told the one about the day a queen put out a fire before it started. They told the one about a king who refused to stand taller than his people even when it would have made him easier to see in a crowd. They told the one about a boy named for a king who chose to be a man instead. They told the one about a girl who killed a knight with a knife light enough to hold in one hand. Under it all, the sea kept eating the cliffs. The wind kept finding cracks to sing in. The godswood kept its own counsel. And in a city that had learned to sleep without nightmares and wake without dread, a woman who had once been a little girl in a bedchamber that smelled of smoke and fear woke one morning and stepped into the light and thought, without surprise, that it would be a good day.